This is a general and also somewhat selective introduction to computational psychiatry, which is a cognitive approach to mental health, where cognitive means understanding is how a behavior is generated at the algorithmic level, and algorithmic level means a description of the rules that can generate the observed behavior. And those algorithms have parameters. And the idea is to measure these computational parameters in order to understand what causes mental illness, to improve diagnosis, including revision of diagnostic criteria where needed, to measure which treatment affects what parameters, both to find out how effective treatment is and to identify gaps in treatment. So imagine you have a treatment that improves patients' life in some way. You then measure more precisely what exactly it is that changes, and you may find that your treatment only affects some of the things that are different in that mental illness, but not others. And if you then fill those gaps, if you change your treatment, or if you design additional treatment that improves those aspects as well, then you should end up with something more effective. So you look at what is it that is actually not changing. And also more precisely targeted treatment. ADHD, as I'll show later, turns out to be a single diagnostic label for 6 different populations. And in a genetic study, which I will not go into now, it was found that the same is true for schizophrenia, that this is a generic term for 6 different things. And if these are really different conditions, then different treatments may be needed for those different populations. So far, understanding what causes mental illness, there is some progress there. So, for example, Frith proposed a model for how misjudging prediction error contributes to some kinds of hallucinations and delusions. Van der Kroes and colleagues presented a model again, how misjudging prediction error could lead to autism. There's a model of obsessive-compulsive disorder. There are measurements of computational parameters in ADHD, and I'll discuss those to explain what computational parameters are. Improving diagnosis, that is happening as well. Again, ADHD will be an example of that. Then measuring which treatment affects what parameters. I'm not aware of an example of that yet, and last time I asked at a conference on computational psychiatry in 2016, nobody could give me an example of that yet, but I consider that to be a very realistic ambition. And the same goes for more precisely targeted treatment. So not yet, but it should be realistic. So looking at diagnosis, the current state and the state that psychiatry has been in for as long as it existed is that conditions are defined by symptoms or clusters of symptoms. And that is as if you went to the doctor who diagnoses you as having a cough and doesn't care what the cause of the cough is, whether it is that you've got a cold, that you've got tuberculosis, that something went down the wrong way, or that you've got lung cancer, and would have one treatment for the cough no matter what the cause is. And you can imagine that the treatment for a cold would be different from the treatment for lung cancer. And the problem then is to get these better diagnoses. And computational psychiatry is one of the approaches that are being pursued to get a better grip on what's going on. And the idea of the computational parameters I'll discuss by explaining the 4 different flavors of impulsivity. One of those is what's called steep temporal discounting. And here's an example that hard work often pays off after time, but laziness always pays off now. And the same would be true for the choice between studying and having some weed. The weed may be, at least for some people, more enjoyable in the short run, but probably hasn't got such good consequences in the long run. And that can be measured more formally. So imagine, for example, that I offer you right now 100 of whatever your local currency is. So here it's krona, it might be euros, pounds, dollars, whatever. So I offer you actually a choice between two banknotes, each worth 100 of whatever. And I ask you, which do you want? And you would be indifferent because they're worth the same thing. And then I apply that principle to different delays. So I ask you, how much, so I offer you a choice between 100 tomorrow and some other amount right now. And probably you would be willing to accept somewhat lesser amount to avoid waiting. And I vary the amount I offer as an alternative to the 100 tomorrow until I find whatever amount it is that is worth the same to you as the 100 tomorrow. Then I do that for 2 days delay, and I again get another amount of money that is worth the same to you as 100 tomorrow. And I can do that for a range of delays and trace here this discounting curve. I can also do that with another amount, for example 120, another 3 days later. One of the interesting things is that empirically it's found that these discounting curves are hyperbolic, and that matters because if they were exponential, the way economists discount value over time, then whichever value at one point in time is above, if you apply the same discounting rate to everything, whichever curve is above would always remain above the other, while hyperbolic curves with the same discounting rate, they can actually cross over. And that means that there are pairings of values, for example 100 and 120, and relative delays where someone will prefer a smaller reward if it is only at a shorter delay. And so here for this discounting rate, that would be this time span. Now people differ in their discounting rate. So you can find people with a steeper discounting rate, and one consequence of that is that the time span over which a smaller but less delayed reward is preferred, that time span is longer. And that has consequences because for at least some of those combinations of delay and reward size, going for the more immediate but smaller reward will actually give you less in the long term than if you wait, if you take the larger and more delayed reward. And that, of course, is counterproductive. Now, there are reasons why temporal discounting exists, and taking one of them out of biology, if you happen to be a small animal whose destiny it is to end its life in a brief crunchy squeak, like so, then there is no point in doing things that only pay off after 5 or 10 years, because it's unlikely that you'll still be alive at that point. So that would be one way in which you could lose delayed rewards, and therefore then delayed rewards are worth less to you because there is a lower probability that you'll actually get them, that you will be able to enjoy them. And David Stevens has written a very nice paper on different kinds of risk and how they relate to temporal discounting. Then we have reward sensitivity. And here is a way in which you can measure that. So that's a different way of being impulsive. Let's say I offer you a choice between these two images, and all you get told is that you may get reward, and you have to find out yourself which of these two images you should choose. So you try that out, and you then find that if you choose this image, 90% of the time you get some reward. If you choose this image, you never get anything, but you don't lose anything either. Then for another pair of images, again, it's reward versus nothing, so, but if you choose this rewarded picture, then you have only an 80% chance of winning, and here again, this here is worth nothing. Then there are other pairs of pictures where what you're trying to do is avoid a loss. So here, if you choose the correct image, you keep your money, while if you make a mistake, you have a 90% probability of losing money. And then there would be another pair of pictures where again it's a choice between the correct one where you don't lose anything and the mistake where you have now an 80% chance of losing money. Then if you have problems with either selectively representing positive or negative outcomes, so if you have problems representing positive outcomes, if I now in a test give you a choice between two pictures that have previously been rewarded, but one of them at 80% rate, the other at 90% rate, then you would have trouble distinguishing that if you haven't got a good and precise representation of positive outcomes. While here, if someone has problems representing negative outcomes, then they'd have problems making a choice between these two, which are associated with either 90 or 80% loss, where of course an 80% chance of loss would be better. And probabilities with representing positive outcomes occur with schizophrenia patients who have what's called negative symptoms, and you can see that it's quite logical that if this here is your problem, if you have problems with representing positive outcomes, then of course in cases where actions is motivated by expecting a positive outcome and you have problems with representing such positive outcomes, then you would suffer from reduced motivation, which is what the negative symptoms are, or at least it's an important part of that. So in schizophrenia with negative symptoms, there is an impairment in wanting things and being motivated to do something to achieve positive outcomes, even though once they occur, they like them as much as anyone else. So the liking is intact, the wanting is impaired. And that is actually this reward sensitivity then is another computational parameter that can be measured by a task such as this. And if you have problems representing negative outcomes, then you're less affected by loss or by punishment or the expectation by punishment. One possible consequence of that, for example, is pathological gambling. And in Parkinson's disease, which has long been considered to be a disease of movement, it comes from neurons that produce dopamine dying off. So one treatment is then just raising the dopamine level, but it turns out that dopamine has two different functions, and it represents two different aspects of reward. One depends on the general level of dopamine, the other depends on changes in dopamine level. It turns out just raising the dopamine level can produce problems, and that treatment of Parkinson's can then lead to pathological gambling, and that seems to be a case of having problems with representing the negative outcomes. And it turns out problems with representing negative outcomes also occur in ADHD. That is something that was recently measured by Taylor. Actually, they measured both temporal discounting and reward sensitivity, and a number of other things, among them the risk of violence, both the risk of being the victim of violence and the risk of perpetrating violence on others. And it turns out that there is some direct relationship between ADHD and risk of violence, but also that ADHD is associated with both temporal discounting and with a bias in reward sensitivity, that reduced sensitivity to negative outcomes. And then of these two different computational parameters, temporal discounting is not reliably associated with the risk of violence, but this bias in reward sensitivity, that is associated. So people who are less sensitive to negative outcomes are more likely to be either the victims or perpetrators of violence. The temporal discounting, though, is associated with increased smoking, with nicotine use. That is also other aspects of ADHD also contribute that, but one thing that is associated with ADHD, which was measured in that study, that is associated with increased smoking, is that nicotine use. And that would be, again, a case of whatever enjoyment people get out of smoking is immediate. The costs of smoking, the illness, that is delayed. And if people then assign greater value to immediate rewards than others, then of course they're more tempted by those immediate rewards and less deterred by the delayed costs. So both ADHD and reward sensitivity then can affect long-term choices. The difference is that to temporal discounting, only magnitude and time matters, not whether the outcome is positive or negative, because you can get the same effect as you have for immediate or delayed rewards, could also occur with immediate or delayed losses or punishments. So, for example, temporal discounting then can explain why people during the witchcraft craze in Europe and America under torture confessed to witchcraft, even though they knew that worse torture would come when they would be burned alive at the stake. That would be then temporal discounting, stopping the pain right now, even if that means more pain later. And that would also explain why it's nonsense to expect that you can use torture to get the truth out of people by threatening more torture if they tell lies. Still, you can expect to tell whatever they believe their torturers will want to hear. Then another kind of impulsivity is a failure of stop signal. An example would be this oops experience where you say, did I say that out loud, where something slips out that you really shouldn't have said. And that might happen even if you know in advance that you shouldn't say it. Let's say you hear of a story that you think is funny, and even though you know that it's the kind of joke that will offend the people to whom you are telling it now, it may slip out anyway. Or something, some secret that you want to keep, and again it slips out anyway because you are thinking of it right now. So how could you measure the propensity to have such an oops experience? And here's an example of such a task called the stop signal reaction time task. So in this example, people are looking at a circle on a screen, and then at somewhat irregular intervals they get a go stimulus to which they are supposed to respond as quickly as possible. Let's say you have your finger on the space bar. Whenever you see that arrow, you hit the space bar as quickly as possible. Except in occasional trials, in a small proportion of trials, you get a stop signal, which in this study was a sound. And then you're supposed not to hit the space bar, just make no response at all. Then the experimenter looks at the distribution of your response times. So you will not always respond exactly after so many milliseconds. There will be a bit of variation in there. And of course, the later the stop signal comes, the more difficult it is for you to inhibit your response. So if you've already sent off the signal that will move your muscle, then you can't stop that response when you hear the stop signal. So the stop signal is adjusted until you can inhibit about half of the responses. Those would be mostly those that happen to take a bit longer for whatever reason. The stop signal can still come in time. And what then is being measured is what's the time between here, that stop signal, and the moment where you can inhibit. So that's basically how long it takes you to inhibit. And of course, the longer it takes you to inhibit a response, the more time a response has to slip through and give you that oops experience. And so that was studied in ADHD, where then this stop signal response time, it turns out, is longer in ADHD. So people who are suffering from ADHD are more vulnerable to these oops experiences than controls. And you can see that it's quite some difference between about 150 and nearly 200. Although the medication that was being tested in that study reduces this stop signal reaction time. Then another kind of impulsivity is a failure to trade off speed against accuracy. And for that, I'll try to demonstrate the dot motion task. And I'll have to start off this program and hope that it actually starts up in time. Sometime soon, perhaps? Right. So this is a task where some dots move randomly and some proportion of dots move coherently in one direction. In this case, it's 1/3 of the dots, well, just under 1/3, 30% of the dots moving up. And that is pretty obvious, so you could respond to this very quickly and just say that it moves up. Then you get another trial here where, for example, the dots move down. And your task is to distinguish, are they moving up or are they moving down, whichever dots are moving coherently. Now, imagine that I offer you 3 points for each correct decision, up or down, and that these 3 points translate into enough money that you actually care about this, and you can look at this for as long as you like. And let's say these 3 points motivate you enough that you look for long enough to have a 90% chance of making a correct decision. So on average, for each trial, you would be earning 90% of 3 points, which is 2.7 points. That would be the accuracy condition. Then I set up another bunch of trials, which is the speed condition, where, for example, I say if you pressed the correct key immediately, you would get 5 points, but for each second's delay, you lose 1 point. So if you waited 5 seconds, if it took you 5 seconds to make up your mind, you would have 0 points. If, on the other hand, you just hit randomly, then you get it right half of the time, if up and down are equally common, and on average you'd earn 2.5 points. And if on average it takes you 1 second to get, say, 80% of them right, then you would have 80% of 4 points, and that would be 3.2. So that would be better than either random responding or taking a whole 5 seconds. So in that case, if the 90% correct took you 5 seconds, but you can get the 80% correct in 1 second, then of course you would trade off the accuracy. You would accept a lower accuracy for higher speed. So that's a speed accuracy trade-off. And of course, this is then more interesting when the coherence is lower, when it's more difficult to see whether this goes predominantly up or down. I have to get rid of that. So that is failure to trade off speed against accuracy. That was tested again in people with ADHD, and it turns out that the controls make a bigger change to their accuracy in order to gain speed than the people with ADHD. And also the controls kept the total amount they earned steady, while the ADHD patients decreased their earnings in the speed condition because they couldn't adjust enough. So there is this speed accuracy trade-off. So it turns out that all four kinds of impulsivity can be found in ADHD. These four kinds can, of course, interact. So this oops experience could come because you don't know in advance that whatever you're saying offends your listeners, and once you've started, you can't stop in time because basically you need a longer time for the stop signal to be effective. So that would be one way to get the oops experience. But also imagine that you have some notion in advance that your remark will offend at least some of the people there, right? So some may find it funny, some may find it offensive, but if you're not sensitive to negative outcomes, then you would be less affected by the people who find it offensive, and again there is a larger chance that it slips out. And then if once it actually starts happening, if you start seeing the negative reaction, then you would, because of the failure of the stop signal, have a greater problem in stopping. So it's not necessary for there to be only one kind of impulsivity work at any one time. In a single person, there can be more than one kind of impulsivity operating simultaneously. So now let's look a bit more at ADHD. This is a study by Fair and colleagues where they measured a whole bunch of things. And when you do that, it goes by the fancy name of a multidimensional profile, which means just that you're measuring several different things. And there really are different things. So for example here, inhibition is measured by that stop signal reaction time we already talked about, and by different variations of the Stroop task, where you are shown words printed in letters, or shown on the screen in letters of different colors, and you have congruent versions where the word red is shown in red letters, the word blue is shown in blue letters, and so on. And you're supposed to name always the color of the letters, not what the words, not what the letters spell out, but the color of the letters. And when you have then the word blue, but it's in red letters, the automatic thing is to read the word blue. You have to stop that instead of saying blue when you are asked to do things as quickly as possible. So in the incongruent case, where the conflict between the meaning of the word and the color of the letters, you have to send a stop signal again. So this is then a similar logic to the stop signal reaction time task. And so you have different ways of measuring the same thing. So this is only one kind of impulsivity that was being measured in that task. They then did the same thing with working memory, 4 different tasks for working memory. Then here they measure a bunch of other things: arousal and activation, response variability, temporal information processing, memory span, and processing speed. If you then average across all those things, so if you take a whole lot of normally developing children and children with ADHD, and you look then at inhibition, and here the way it's plotted is that up means a problem. Here in the middle, that black line is the average for the whole population, and it turns out that the kids diagnosed with ADHD are statistically reliably worse at all those 7 things. But that is what you get when you just average across the whole population. You can also do something that's called a cluster analysis. There the idea is you plot everyone's value along several different axes. For example, you might be plotting here inhibition. So ability to inhibit, where here are the people who are really good at it and here are the people who are really bad at it. And it might actually turn out that people separate into several clusters along this axis. Then you plot here, say, working memory. And here, for example, it looks like in working memory, people are all if that were it, these three groups are actually pretty much at the same level. Here's another group who is different. So the question is, do people fall into these distinct clusters where the people within a cluster are more similar to each other than they are similar to people outside of the cluster? And it turns out that's what you get in ADHD. So, and also in the normally developing children. So the normally developing children already divide into 4 different profiles. So here you have a group where, and that is here in the middle, they have all a problem with response variability, and the ADHD kids with that profile are still significantly worse on everything that is being measured, but note that on these 6 parameters, so everything except response variability, they are actually slightly better than the population average. They happen to be worse than normally developing kids with the same profile, but when you go across the whole population, on 6 of those things, they're at the population average. So one thing they really have a problem with is this here, and you might argue actually that possibly it might be a problem for the normally developing kids as well. So if you want to develop a treatment, the thing that you should focus on is this response variability. Then here you have profile 2, where it's the opposite way around. So they are basically the ones who are good at response variability, but have problems with other parameters, like, for example, inhibition and working memory. And here the memory span and the processing speed. So even the normally developing kids are worse than the population average here, and actually not significantly different from ADHD kids with the same profile. They're not different at response variability either. Where the ADHD kids are different is here in arousal and in temporal information processing. Then in the ADHD group you have another subgroup that look like this profile on most things, except they are worse here and slightly worse here. Right? And this is the same group again for the normally developing kids as here, because there is no difference. It's just the ADHD that here split into 2 subclusters. Or look at this here. Again, the ADHD kids are significantly worse than normally developing kids at inhibition and working memory, but they are exactly at the population average. They are again worse than the normally developing kids here on response variability, but again at the population average. Where they are another thing where they are worse than the normally developing kids with the same profile is what is it, temporal information processing, and that's where they are a lot worse than the population average. So for those kids, this might be the thing to focus on, and so on. So you have then these different profiles where they separate into these, for the normally developing kids 4, and for the ADHD kids, well, the kids with ADHD, into 6 different subpopulations, 6 different clusters. One thing that is not clear here is whether actually the ADHD and the normally developing kid, whether they form a different cluster or whether that's unimodal. And I'll discuss that in a bit more detail when I get to autism. So then a brief look at autism and schizophrenia, where there are some theories that claim that autism and schizophrenia are opposites on some or other dimension, and other theories claim that autism and schizophrenia have something in common. In this task, the setup is you see this picture and you get an instruction from one of those directors. And if it's this director and you're asked to move the scissors 1 shelf down, then you can, it's a computer task, so you can click on the scissors and you can drag them down here. And you can also expect that the director wouldn't be referring to the apple because there is a wall at the back of the shelf and that director can't see the apple. Right? So the director's view is, if you flip that around, the director's view is of these things. That's what the director can see. If you then have a situation like this, where the director asks you to move the box to the left, or then of course it's unclear whether it's that box or that box. So if you then just pick one of these boxes and you move it to the left, either of those responses would be correct. But if you pick that box, that is a box that the director can't see. So that is a box that the director can't be referring to. So that would be then a mistake in taking the view of the director into account. While if you have this here, of course, you haven't got the opportunity to make this kind of mistake. And when Abu Akel and colleagues then looked at the errors in that perspective making task, and they plotted it against autism tendencies, where this here means high tendencies towards autism, these here low, and tendencies towards psychosis, where again this here means high psychosis, this here is low. So here in this corner here, the near corner, you have people with neither tendency, and they're doing pretty well on this perspective taking task. People with autism have more problems. Also people with psychosis, so they both make the mistakes in this perspective taking task. So that looks a bit like they have something in common. But there are also people here in this far corner which have tendencies towards both autism and psychosis, and it turns out there these people are as good as the people with neither tendency. And so then the assumption is that there is something to do with perspective taking, in which people with autism and people with psychosis are opposites, and if you have both tendencies, these opposite parameters just cancel each other out. But autism and psychosis can't be opposites in all respects, because if they were, these people wouldn't exist. It wouldn't be possible to have both tendencies. You would then just be normal. So the results of Abu Akel and colleagues then suggest that autism and schizophrenia are opposites in at least one thing, but not all. So there must be computational parameters of autism and, in which autism and schizophrenia are opposites, and other computational parameters in which they're not. So then, looking at diagnosis again, officially in the diagnostic manual, there are 3 core traits of autism. And these are impairments in social interaction, in communication, and in stereotype behaviors or special interests. It turns out actually that there is a question whether these things really go together. So this is just by definition in the diagnostic manual, but this could be just problem with selection, a selection bias. So if I chose out of the whole population only people who have red hair, beards and tattoos, and I look just at that population, then of course I get the impression that red hair, beards and tattoos go together. To find out whether that is really true, I have to look at the whole population and see whether there's any association between them, right? So looking at only people who are already defined by those traits doesn't help me. Therefore, there is no point looking at autistics and comparing them against the general population. Then you will get the impression that these 3 traits go together. But Hape, Ronald and Plomin did a study with about, I think it was 7,000 twins, and measured these 3 core traits. And what they find is that if you, for example, plotted social difficulties here, where here towards the right are greater social difficulties, and here you plotted communicational difficulties, where up here are greater communication difficulties, then you have a low correlation and you haven't got the clusters which I showed between the different subtypes in both normally developing children and children with ADHD. So you haven't got separate clusters, you have only a unimodal distribution, so there is a single cluster, and then autism is just happens to be defined as you're so far out along this axis, you're so far out along this axis, and so this space here, and in the third dimension, which I can't show here, and in the third dimension, so a little corner of that three-dimensional space, that gets called autism, but there isn't anything really that separates, that cleanly separates these people from the general population. So it's pretty arbitrary where you put your cutoff point. It could have been put here, it could have been put here. And also, what you then find is that there are people, for example, who might have greater communication difficulties but don't get an autism diagnosis, or people with greater social difficulties who don't get an autism diagnosis because they make that cutoff only along one or two of the dimensions, not on all of them. So measuring this kind of thing is again useful to find out whether the definition of a condition really makes sense, whether it identifies a distinct population or whether it just happens to be the extreme of a normal distribution where things become different enough that it's a problem in the society in which the people are living. That is another thing. So problems may depend on where you live and how well your traits are accepted or tolerated in that society. And mental illness quite often is one of the unspoken criteria is it creates a problem in the society in which you happen to live. Right? And so autism then happens to be something where in the societies in which the diagnosis was created, if you're far enough out on those three things, then it creates problems for you. And also the coincidence of those three traits makes you particularly conspicuous, and then people notice that more and then attach the name to people who happen to have all three things together. So if I now summarize, the idea is that we wanted, oh hang on, I forgot one thing. So if we're looking at understanding what causes mental illness, I haven't gone into that here, but I'll make another video for that. So yes, that is happening. Improving diagnosis by measuring computational parameters. So things, aspects of your mental processes that are quantifiable, that make a difference to behavior, where if we knew enough, we could basically write a procedure that says this is how the behavior is produced. If you change that parameter continuously, quantitatively, then behavior will change in this specific way. And the idea is that this is a better characterization of people in general, that this gives a better characterization of the variety of different minds. And in the cases where the tuning of a particular computational parameter is so different from the average that it creates a problem, again, that is identifiable and more precisely identifiable than the diagnostic criteria we have at the moment. And once you've got that, of course, once you can identify what characterizes a condition and do it a bit more precisely, so that instead of having one label like ADHD for 6 different conditions, and remember in Fair's study, they only included 1 of 4 different kinds of impulsivity. If you measured the other 3 kinds of impulsivity as well, it's at least conceivable that you might find more varieties of what is now being called ADHD. So you might find some people who have a very low sensitivity to negative outcomes, other people who have a normal sensitivity, but very steep temporal discounting. These people would act somewhat differently, and if there are such distinct subtypes, then again you would have to see, can you do something about temporal discounting, or can you do something about reward sensitivity? So then you could target things more precisely. As I said, I'm not aware of that happening yet, but it's at least a plausible ambition. So more precisely targeted treatments, and also identifying gaps in treatment. And that is all for now.